Welcome back to the big ugly Tuono project. In the last episode I rebuilt the shock and linkage, so this time it's onto the front end. So that's the newly rebuilt shock back in the bike. So now I need to move on to the front end. So what I'm going to do here is get a paddock stand under the headstock to lift the whole of the front of the bike up. I'm then going to remove the calipers, the mudguard, the front wheel, and then I can slide the forks out. The front of the bike is now on a paddock stand, so the front wheel's off the floor, mudguard's off. I've just got to take the calipers off and the front brake off. And the one thing I am doing before I take the forks out is measuring that distance there, which is about 8.5mm, and we're on sort of the first ring of the fork leg is showing. So we know where we are to put them back in the same place. As with the rear shock, the first things I'm going to do is write down the settings and give them a bit of a clean, because they've got a bit of fly stuck to them and a little few marks on the chrome. I don't think any of it's pitting, but once I get it properly cleaned up I will know for sure. And then I can take them apart. I'm not going crazy and taking the damper rods out because I'm actually quite happy with how they ride. I'm just going to play around with air gaps and spring rates. So I've got the first fork in the vise, and what I'm going to do next is just unwind this leg, drop it down, and then I can get to the bits so I can take the fork cap off and take the springs and spacers out. Now I'm going to take the springs and spacers out and then put the fork cap back on and actually see how much travel the damper rod has. Because if we look at this leg down here, we have quite a lot, about 30mm of fork leg that we're not using. And I don't know at this stage whether that's because the damper rod isn't particularly long, or whether the air gap's too small and we're basically coming to a artificial stop before it hits the bump stop. So I'm going to do some measurements as I take them apart, and then I can alter the air gap accordingly. I can tell straight away why we're not using much travel, because even though the springs and spacers are still in, you do the air gap with them out, that's a lot of oil in a fork leg. It's nearly at the top. So I suspect at some point these have had fork seals done and somebody's just poured a load of oil in and not set the levels properly. So that will be a distinct improvement. So I've got the spring and the spacer tube out, and I think what displaced a lot of the oil was the fact the spacer tube is massive. So there's not actually as much oil in there as I thought. I've just measured it. There's a 108mm air gap, which is about what I'd expect on a normal road fork. But I think I can still make it better. So I've got both legs apart now. The second leg is draining into the sink, and the first leg I've put the fork cap back on, and we can see at the bottom we've got about 5-6mm of travel left. So that tells me when we're braking and I've got this much fork left, that we're probably too tight on the air gap. And because it looks like a small air gap with the exceedingly long spacer and bits in it, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reduce the oil level, thus increasing the air gap, so that it uses more of the stroke. Also, I have actually got some softer springs. So at the moment we're on standard springs, which are, according to the internet, 0.95 newtons per kilograms per millimetre, and I'm going to go to 0.9, but I'm only going to change one spring. So one leg is going to be 0.95, the other leg will be 0.85, giving us a 0.9 average. So both legs are well drained of oil now, so the next thing to do is pop the dust seals up, flick the circlips out, hammer the legs apart and change the bushes and seals in them. That is the new seals and bushes from B&C Express. They're K-Tech items. They're now fitted to the left-hand leg, so the next thing to do is pour oil in it. Now Aprilia say you can use anything from 5 weight to 20 weight, but I'm using 5 weight because I tend to put 5 weight in everything. It's more consistent because it's lighter, it doesn't cavitate as easily, so it tends to be more consistent. And I'm going to go for a slightly bigger air gap. Now when I measured it, the air gap was 108mm, but we've got 20mm or so of travel we're not using. So I'm going to go 130mm on the air gap. I've poured a reasonable quantity of oil into the fork leg, and I've moved the outer up and down a couple of times to make sure we're pushing the oil out of the little bleed holes and getting oil around the bushes and seals. And then I've pumped the piston up and down a few times, the damper rod, to make sure we're getting actual damping in the rod to bleed the air out of it, and that now feels pretty good. So I'm just going to leave it for a few minutes for the air bubbles to come out the oil, which you might not be able to see down there. Give that a couple of minutes to settle, and then I shall set my air gap. So with my fancy new air gap oil level setting tool, I shall pop that in there, and then once I have 2 hands spare, I shall pull the plunger up, and that will set my air gap. I was going to be fitting new fork springs, but unfortunately I've been sent a set for the Öhlins type forks, not the standard forks. So, not the end of the world, I shall put it back together with the new air gap set, and I'll be at least able to test whether the air gap improvement helps. If it doesn't, then I shall just order some springs and change them later. So, as I put the top cap back on, the top cap has the damper adjuster, the rebound adjuster, actually attached to it. So, what happens is, as we screw in the little flathead screwdriver bit on the fork cap there, that pushes that needle in or out of the damper rod and basically opens or closes the bypass, so it pushes more or less fluid, oil, through the shim stack on the rebound side. A little bit like the bits inside the shock, but considerably smaller. That is the first leg all back together, with the original spring in it, but with the air gap set to 130mm. When I actually checked the manual, it should be 122mm air gap, so the 108 was definitely wrong, so I think my 130 will be better. The thing to just remember when you're putting the forks back together is to get the nut in the correct place when you're putting the preload adjuster back onto the damper rod. Otherwise, your rebound adjuster will have either too much or too little adjustment in it, neither of which are very good. While I've got half the front end apart, it would seem like the golden opportunity to check the steering head bearings and re-grease them. So, I'll just pop the jack under the front of the bike, and that will take the weight. I can loosen everything off, lower the front paddock stand, and just pop the yoke down far enough to get to the bearings. Smear a bit of grease in them, put them back together hopefully. So that's everything removed, so I can drop this down, and there is at least grease on the bearings, so I'm just going to give them a little fresh coat of grease and pop it all back together. So it turns out on closer inspections when I cleared the old grease off, the bottom head race bearing, it was actually about knackered. So I'm just popping everything back together sort of loose for now so that I can carry on and fit my new handlebars. And then I'm going to have to get a new set of head race bearings for it. So here are my new handlebars compared to my old ones. And what you can tell straight away is they're quite a lot different. The angle's different, they're lower, they're less swept back, so it should give it a bit more front-end bias, a little bit more aggressive riding position. So the trial fit of the bars, because the taper doesn't peel off as quickly as it does on the standard bars, you have to sort of shove everything along a little bit. I mean, everything fits, but where I thought we'd have maybe 20mm to cut off the ends, we've actually got about 5mm. But when you sit on it, it feels a lot more aggressive, and it's a bit lower down. And most importantly, it's black. So, I think what I'm going to do is do some marking out and drill the holes for the switch gears. So looking up to the bottom of the bars, I've put a bit of tape on and put the switch gear on and, you know, giving it a little bit of a wobble around so I can mark where it is. So we've got a mark on both sides, so I'm now going to take the handlebars off and drill holes in them. Once you go black, you never go back, apparently. Compared to the standard bars, they look better. They feel considerably more aggressive. I've even turned down some little bar end weights for them. Well, bar end plugs. If they vibrate too much, I will actually have to put some weight in it. But yeah, that's a massive improvement. So, it's been a fairly long afternoon in the workshop, but we've made good progress. The chock is rebuilt, so that should be like new. I've got my new Aprilia Tech washers fitted and the linkage is all greased and back together, so that'll be good for a good few thousand miles yet. The forks didn't entirely go to plan because I was going to change spring rate and I didn't have the right springs, but the air gap was wrong, and now that I've set it where I think it should be, it'll be interesting to see what difference that makes without changing the springs. So it's all sort of, you know, sensible testing. It does need new steering head bearings because the ones that are in it are not in the best shape. But it's okay to ride around on for now. and I shall get to me in the next few days. And most importantly, I suppose, I've got my new handlebars fitted, and they're not gold. They're black, they feel more aggressive. I'm actually looking forward to riding it and seeing what it's really like on the road. So, join me again next time when we'll be doing, hopefully, the finishing touches to the Big Ugly project.